Yes.
So a couple of points of housekeeping just at the start. First of all, the presentation, I understand, is now up on the website, and so people will be able to access it there. It should also have been provided on the CP workspaces. The second point is that I earlier referred to some paragraph numbers from the written presentation. Due to my own error, these are out by 5. So if I said paragraph 9, it should be paragraph 14. I won't bore you with the reasons for that, but I will be careful about doing that in the future. And we will arrange for the transcript to be corrected so that the correct paragraph numbers are given.
Thank you.
Turning back to where we left off, sir, which was the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia and its first meeting on the 20th of March 1973. We've looked at Dr. Biggs's paper, which was considered by the group. Dr. Maycock also provided 2 papers dealing firstly with capacity figures for the production of factor 8 and secondly dealing with the responses to a survey that he had conducted of haemophilia clinicians about their preferred use of product. I won't take you to those documents. I will just point out that paragraph 39, that is the correct reference on the presentation, Dr. Maycock set out the different capacities of BPL, PFL, and PFC. His calculation was a total capacity to fractionate 1,145 litres per week once certain works had been completed. He also said that in order to meet the preference of haemophilia clinicians, 4/5 of blood donations, so 80% of blood donations, should be assigned to concentrate production, which he put at a figure of about 330,000 donations per year. He summarised the survey responses by saying that 33 of 34 haemophilia centres have responded to him. Of those, 2 were said to prefer using cryoprecipitate, 14 were said to prefer using concentrate, and 17 preferred to use both. We'll come on later to some other assessments made of preferences between cryo and concentrate. So those were Dr. Maycock's papers, and we will turn now to the minutes of the meeting itself. If we could go, please, to PRSE 304706, Paul. The first page, we can see that this is the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia, meeting held on the 20th of March 1973. In the chair is Dr. Reed. We can also see the other members, Dr. Biggs, Professor Blackburn, Professor Douglas, Dr. Maycock, Dr. Rizza, Mr. John of the DHSS, Dr. MacDonald of the Scottish Home and Health Department, Dr. Thomas of the DHSS, Mr. Walters of the DHSS, Mr. Gardner of the DHSS, and Dr. Sheila Waiter of the DHSS, who was with Mr. Gardner, the secretary. Dr. Waiter is a significant figure in the months to come. She was the predecessor of Dr. Walford in the role that Dr. Walford would take from 1978 or 1979. The terms of reference are on the first page, just a little bit lower down, Paul. And those terms of reference are to advise the department on trends in methods of treatment of haemophilia and allied conditions, and to consider possible future requirements for the treatment of the condition and the consequences for the supply of therapeutic agents. I pause to note, sir, that a different version of the terms of reference refers to the departments, plural, which may reflect the presence on the committee of Dr. MacDonald of the Scottish Home and Health Department. I believe that Professor Douglas was from the University of Aberdeen as well. Regardless of whether or not department has given them the single or the plural, there was certainly SHHD representation at this committee, and so whether they were advised or merely informed is perhaps a moot point. If we could go over to the second page, please, Paul. I'm not going to go through all of this paper because much of it repeats the analysis that Dr. Biggs has given in her paper. We can see that there is the comparison of therapeutic materials, and then discussion of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried concentrate. If I pick it up from the final paragraph, there is this said about the safety aspect of concentrates, and I quote, "A possible disadvantage arises from the fact that AHG concentrate is prepared from a larger pool of donations, and in theory, therefore, the risk of hepatitis is greater. About 1 in 800 of the donors who present to the transfusion service is a carrier of hepatitis B antigen. The present policy of rejecting donations which give a positive test for hepatitis B antigen will reduce the incidence of virus in the blood used to make plasma pools. In practice, studies in several centres have shown that the incidence of hepatitis among severely affected patients who have been treated with freeze-dried preparation is not very much higher than that of the centres not using freeze-dried concentrate, and this suggests that the development of hepatitis in these multi-transfused patients may be dose-related. It was agreed that the theoretically increased risk of acquiring hepatitis, which does not seem to be borne out in practice, should not be a deterrent to using the freeze-dried preparation, and in any case, this complication will decrease with universal screening of donors for hepatitis antigen." That is what is said at the meeting, obviously building on what is said in Dr. Biggs's paper. We go down to section 4, future requirements of therapeutic agents. I'll just read from this section and to the end of the document. I quote, "During 1972, considerably more cryoprecipitate from freeze-dried concentrate was issued in terms of donations of blood. It was generally agreed that 400,000 donations would be required to treat UK sufferers from haemophilia of all degrees of severity, and more if strenuous efforts were made to clear surgical waiting lists and if home treatment or eventually prophylactic treatment became accepted ways of dealing with the problems of haemophiliacs. Life-saving surgery has been undertaken for some time using the therapeutic agents which are available, but clinicians must now look to the possible improvement in the quality of life of boys and men who suffer from haemophilia. Since more freeze-dried AHG concentrate has become available from 2 foreign sources, the prospect of improved management of day-to-day bleeding episodes using this therapeutic agent has become realistic. If the anticipated annual uptake of 20 million units of freeze-dried AHG concentrate is to be met from foreign commercial sources, the cost will be of the order of £2 million per annum, assuming the cost to be 10 pence per unit. At present, UK production is considerably less than the required amount of a freeze-dried preparation. It was agreed that there was an immediate need to discuss the advisability of central purchase and distribution of the 2 commercially produced preparations. There is also a pressing need to seek ways of increasing UK production with the intention of reducing and, as soon as possible, ending purchase from foreign sources. Freeze-dried AHG concentrate is made at the Blood Products Laboratory, Elstree, at the Plasma Fractionation Laboratory, Oxford, and at the Blood Products Laboratory, Edinburgh. Note the phrasing there is slightly wrong, but we'll move on. It is essential the production and distribution of the therapeutic agents concerned should be considered as a UK exercise. In any consideration of increased UK production of freeze-dried AHG concentrate, the immediate problems are those of the organisation and cost of increasing donations of either whole blood or plasma by plasmapheresis, and the difficulties, including cost, of increasing the capacity of the laboratories at present engaged in production. Close cooperation between England, including Wales and Northern Ireland, and Scotland will be required in order to coordinate and optimise blood collection and transport. For fractionation processes, distribution of the therapeutic agents, and utilisation of other blood fraction byproducts. Recommendations by the expert group. 1. DHSS should give early consideration to central purchase of freeze-dried AHG concentrate from the firms who have recently been granted product licenses. 2. Distribution to other haemophilia centres and hospitals should be through the regional centres, 3 of which are in Oxford, Manchester and Sheffield in England, 1 in Scotland, Edinburgh or Glasgow, and 1 in London, to be decided. The establishment of such a distribution scheme would be a prerequisite of Recommendation 1 in order to ensure the most effective use of available material. 3. At the same time, the UK should aim to become self-sufficient as soon as possible by increasing home production of freeze-dried AHG concentrate. 4. The regional transfusion directors should be consulted about the consequences of Recommendation 3 in terms of increased demands upon the blood transfusion services throughout the UK. Discussion should take place between DHSS and the directors about problems of decreasing productions of cryoprecipitate, increasing production of fresh frozen plasma for fractionation, and the possibly increased collection of plasma by plasmapheresis. 5. There should be further meetings of this expert group at times to be arranged. Several subjects need to be discussed further, including home treatment and, in due course, prophylactic treatment. 6. The expert group membership might be expanded to include representatives of each of the regional haemophilia centres, a representative of the regional transfusion directors, and possibly a SAMO, which is a scientific area medical officer. I'll come back to SAMO, but a regional scientific medical officer of some form. It was also suggested that the National Medical Director of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association and Mr. Watt of the Edinburgh BPL should be invited to join the group. Edinburgh BPL is a reference to the PFC in Edinburgh. So we can see there's support for the position put forward by Dr. Biggs, reference to a need for 400,000 donations to treat UK sufferers from haemophilia of all degrees of severity, which goes back to one of the questions that you were asking earlier, and more if strenuous efforts were made to clear surgical waiting lists and if home treatment or eventually prophylactic treatment became accepted. So 400,000 as the minimum. Reference as well to the costs of commercial imports, £2 million a year, and 2 strands of development proposed. One is a central contract to buy commercial products, and the other is efforts to increase domestic production. And the meeting referred both to the need to increase plasma supply and to consider the fractionation capacity of the different fractionation centres in the UK.
If we just look at what's currently on the screen at the moment, just before we get to recommendations, it sounds a bit like another recommendation, the very last paragraph, close cooperation.
Close cooperation between England, including Wales and Northern Ireland, and Scotland will be required in order to coordinate and optimise blood collection and transport, the fractionation processes, distribution of the therapeutic agents, and utilisation of other blood fraction byproducts. Yes, sir. A point which is, in fact, that is a repetition of a point which was made earlier in the meeting as well. So something that the group considered to be very important. You'll note there, sir, that Northern Ireland is grouped with England at that stage rather than Scotland, because at that time the blood products were obtained from BPL. Later, of course, it would be PFC. On the point about cooperation, I refer back to the discussion at the start of looking at this document about the presence of Dr. MacDonald of the SHHD at this meeting.
And I think you said Dr. Douglas as well.
Dr. Douglas from Aberdeen. That was what the expert group said. The response to that group within the DHSS can be seen in a series of letters which are summarised in the written presentation. I won't take you to those. I will, however, flag the fact that one of those letters, from Dr. Reid to Dr. Waiter, which is described at paragraph 47, ruled out spending £2 million per year on blood products, but suggested that if £250,000 to £500,000 could be found in the current financial year, so that is the financial year from 1973 to 1974, then it would provide time to explore the possibility of the UK expanding production. Those figures, £250,000 to £500,000, will reoccur later on. The working assumption within those internal DHSS documents is that it would take around 2 years before domestic production could meet the total demand. So it's talking about 1975 as a possible date for self-sufficiency as defined by the requirements set out in that document. A meeting was held to discuss the expert group recommendations in May 1973. And if we could go to that, please, Paul. It's DHSC 01-00005_022. We can see that present at this meeting were Mr. Giddon, of one of the divisions of the Health Service divisions of the DHSS, so an administrative civil servant and somebody who is important in the development of the policy that comes. Dr. MacDonald, again, from the SHHD, Mr. Taylor from the DHSS, Dr. Maycock, in his capacity as consultant advisor to the DHSS, Dr. Duncan Thomas, Dr. Waiter, and then Mr. Pearson, Mr. Walters, and Mr. Fenner, all of different divisions within the DHSS. Reading from the minutes, paragraph 1, Mr. Giddens said that the meeting had been arranged to consider the issues arising from the recommendations of the expert group on haemophilia, including possible arrangements for central purchase and distribution of commercially produced AHG concentrate and for expansion of UK production. Mr. Taylor referred to the anticipated UK annual uptake of 20 million units and said that if it was decided to purchase the material commercially, the estimated cost of £2 million would almost certainly have to be met from existing financial allocations. It was most unlikely that the Treasury would make additional funds available. I pause there, sir, to say that is a prediction which is proved accurate. So in the discussion which follows in the coming year, the references to budgets are always to the internal DHSS budget. If the money is going to come from somewhere, it has to come from within the DHSS. There isn't additional Treasury funding being made available for the increased purchase of blood products or for the development of blood products domestically. Back to the document at paragraph 3. Dr. Maycock said that the professional opinion was that clinicians and the pressure group representing patients felt strongly that the quality of treatment would be greatly improved if there were sufficient supplies of freeze-dried AHG concentrates to replace a large proportion of the cryoprecipitate at present used. Dr. Waiter and Dr. Thomas supported this view and stressed that the development of AHG concentrates was a major advance in the treatment of haemophilia. clinicians preferred to treat episodes of bleeding by giving infusions of freeze-dried concentrate as early as possible. Programs of home treatment and possibly in future prophylactic treatment, which will be feasible when the freeze-dried material becomes more widely available, would, in the long term, reduce treatment costs and the demand on hospital facilities. Dr. Maycock thought the cost of increasing production in the UK to meet estimated requirements should be less than the cost of importing material from commercial sources. Dr. MacDonald said that he had not looked at the problem solely from the cost point of view. He felt that departments should, wherever possible, avoid involvement with commercial firms on all matters concerning blood transfusion, including the production of AHG concentrate. His view, the blood transfusion service should be self-sufficient in all respects. Pause there, sir, to pick up a couple of points from that paragraph. The first is, again, we see reference to the preference of clinicians for the use of concentrate over cryoprecipitate, expressed forcefully by Dr. Maycock and supported by Dr. Waiter and Dr. Thomas. Also reference to home treatment and possibly in the future prophylactic treatment, but the latter stated to be in the future. Dr. Maycock gave his view that ultimately there would be a cost saving of domestic products because it would mean you had to import less of the more expensive commercial products, though it is important to note that is not quantified in this document, no calculation presented. And interestingly, Dr. MacDonald from the Scottish Home and Health Department puts forward a more principled view of the need for self-sufficiency. So leaving cost aside as a point of principle, he feels that the domestic blood service should be self-sufficient. When I say principled, I mean putting it forward as a point of principle, not a judgment value on whether that is a more morally sound position. Paragraph 4 of the minutes of the meeting. Dr. Maycock said that one estimate was that the plasma from around 416,000 donations of blood would be needed annually in order to prepare the materials considered necessary to treat haemophiliacs in accordance with present views of ideal treatment. At present, about 228,000 donations in England and Wales were used annually for the preparation of these materials. He thought that the BPLs at Elstree and Liberton, when the latter was operational, would have the capacity to increase production of AHG concentrate to meet UK demand, but that some additional staff and equipment would be required at both laboratories. Dr. MacDonald said that the new building at Liberton should be open and functioning by the end of 1974. He had some reservations about pursuing Mr. Watt's statement that the laboratory would be able to prepare AHG concentrate from 2,000 litres of plasma per week. After discussion, it was agreed that the blood transfusion service should increase production of AHG concentrate to meet all UK requirements, provided that the necessary additional funds could be made available. Pause there, so just for, to refer to a couple of matters from that paragraph. A question which may be in your mind about what happens next from the 1974 to 1975 period is why there was no decision taken at that stage to redevelop BPL more fundamentally than the incremental changes that were made. And part of the answer to that question may lie in Dr. Maycock's analysis here, which is repeated in later documents that we will come to, in which he says that if you look at Elstree and Liberton together, then as long as there are some additional staff and equipment made available, then they would have the capacity to increase production of AHG concentrate to meet UK demand. So the suggestion there is that the two fractionation plants can cope with what is going to be asked of them, subject to those pieces of equipment and the staff being made available. If we go to the end of the document, the following action was agreed. Point 7. First action point is supply division, that is a division within the DHSS, should be asked to start negotiations with a view to arranging a central call-off contract for the purchase of freeze-dried AHG on the basis of a demand for 20 million units per annum from about 40 haemophilia centres. Then point 4 as well. Go on to the next page, please. The question of UK production to be referred to the proposed Joint Steering Committee on Blood Products Production for consideration. So again, sir, 2 strands. One is the central contract to purchase commercial concentrates, and the second is further work and a new body, the Joint Steering Committee, to look at domestic production. Those were the action points that were suggested at that meeting.
So, if we just go back to the previous page, supply division starting negotiation on the basis of a demand for 20 million units. Now, earlier in this meeting, we said there was no additional money for that. So, what was being proposed, presumably, was that this would come from existing budgets.
Yes. We will see how how it plays out in the documents that follow. I won't take you to all of them. Is that the DHSS arrange the central contract. They do so to try to take advantage of economies of scale. And that is a contract with the providers of Hemophil and Therapeutic. However, that is arranged centrally, but for each of the regions who wish to purchase the commercial product, they must fund that out of their own budget. There is a debate about whether or not this is going to be centrally funded or regionally funded, and that is answered by the DHSS saying it has to be regionally funded. So the regions will have to decide how much concentrate they want, how much they can afford, and then they will use the concentrates obtained by the DHSS as their source of material, but they will be the ones who are paying for it. Just to finish that section off, sir, it's set out in the written presentation from around about paragraph 54. But the take-up of the take-up by the regional health authorities of the commercial contract of commercial concentrates that DHSS had arranged to purchase from the providers, that take-up was well below the anticipated demand. I won't take you to the document, but a memo from July 1974 states this, and I quote, "Because of the high cost," that's the high cost of the concentrates, "because of the high cost and authorities' current financial difficulties, the uptake of the material during the first 7 months of the contract has been far below the originally estimated level of demand. Travenol, Hemophil, 1.35 million units, 47% of the estimate, and serological products, that's Cryopulin, 244,000 units, which was about 8% of the estimate." So although the commercial contract goes ahead, it is of limited success in increasing the amount of commercial concentrate that is available to clinicians, because regional health authorities are reluctant to buy the concentrates because of their cost. So we think back to October and November when we were looking at the pharmaceutical companies. We discussed briefly the central contract there and the figures that it gave rise to and the costs that it gave rise to. That is all I will say on the central contract. We turn then to the second strand, which is the work that was done on increasing domestic production. And you will have seen from the last meeting that the first step is to set up a new body, the Joint Steering Committee on Blood Products, and that met for the first time in June 1973. And if we could go, Paul, please, to PRSE 304359. This is summarised at paragraph 59 of the written presentation. We can see from the heading that this is the note of the first meeting, and it was held on the 20th of June 1973. The list of those present, Dr. Maycock is in the chair. Then I won't go through all of the names, but there are various regional transfusion directors, another representative of the Blood Products Laboratory, representatives of the DHSS, and representatives of the Scottish Home and Health Department, including Dr. MacDonald and Dr. Bell. From the DHSS, I just note that Dr. Waiter was one of those who was present. If we could turn, I won't go through all of this document, but if we could turn, please, to electronic page 5, paragraph 19. There is a discussion of Dr. Biggs's paper and the previous discussion that had been held about haemophilia treatment. And it says there that, and I quote, the main points that emerged from the discussion were, one, it was decided in principle to treat the UK as a whole, and that the first target should be Dr. Biggs' lower estimate of the plasma from 400,000 donations, with 700,000 donations as the ultimate target. The initial aim should be to provide anti-haemophilic globulin concentrate from 250,000 donations by 1975. The UK should opt initially to meet most of the requirement with an intermediate potency product, but about 10% of the total output should be a high potency product. DHSS was considering making call-off contracts for 2 commercially produced concentrates, which would be available through haemophilia centres. It was agreed that it would be of considerable interest to the Joint Steering Committee to have details of the rate of purchase by the centres. And finally, the UK should aim to be self-sufficient by 1975. And again, so we see the different figures. The initial aim of 250,000 donations. That is part of a first target of 400,000 donations, which is part of a way to an ultimate target of 700,000 donations.
Is there any further detail as to what distinction was seen between intermediate potency and high potency? We've had the descriptions intermediate purity and high purity before, which is explained by removing unnecessary proteins from the fraction. What's potency? This is the amount of activity.
I think, at least I read this as what would later be described as high purity, intermediate purity and intermediate.
It might, however, mean extra concentrated. Just as one buys a bottle, to use a homespun analogy, a bottle of squash, and then you can get a smaller bottle which is supposed to be 3 times as concentrated.
It could mean that, sir. I can't take you to any document which shows this. My sense is that it is probably referring to what later becomes termed purity. But I cannot be sure about that.
Yes. I mean, it's if there's no other document that helps, well, that's just a mystery, and we'll assume that it means one or the other.
we can look into it and see if we can find anything. But the terminology in this period is a little looser than it becomes later.
They knew what they meant.
They knew what they meant, yes. Certainly the sense is that there should be two forms of product, one which would be for general use, as it were, and one which is for a more specialised use.
Yes.
The next meeting of note is on the 20th of July, 1973. I won't take you to the document, but it was a meeting of the regional transfusion directors, which discussed the issue of domestic production and considered a paper, which is referred to in the written presentation at paragraph 60. At that meeting, it was proposed that the figure of 250,000 should actually be increased to 275,000, and the basis for that was a recalculation of how much plasma could be assumed to be obtainable from a single donation. As we saw earlier, there was an estimate from Dr. Biggs of 200 to 220 millilitres, and at this meeting, the regional transfusion directors thought that 180 to 190 millilitres was a more realistic target. And because you were obtaining less plasma from each donation, you would therefore need more donations, hence the figure of 275,000 donations. The same meeting heard that there was an overall deficiency of about 100,000 donations per annum, and that was by reference to the ultimate goal, the first goal of 400,000 donations. So there were about 300,000 donations at the time, and there should be about 400,000 to meet overall need, and of those, 275,000 should go to concentrates. That was the maths that was being done. Now, interestingly, the meeting discusses how that shortfall of 100,000 donations could be made up by the increased use of red cell concentrates. So, as we were discussing earlier, the separation of the whole blood donation into red cell concentrates and plasma. And Appendix 7 that is attached to the written presentation provides some further data on this, and we will look at that in due course. But the shift towards red cell concentrates as a way of increasing domestic production is seen as one of the things that can be done, and can be done relatively quickly at this time. There was also discussion about how a donation target should be distributed amongst the different regional transfusion centres in proportion to the total number of donations that they collected. So the idea there of setting each centre a target for the number of donations that it should provide. Now, the meeting was told, paragraph 4 of the note, and I quote, "It was expected that the necessary fractionation capacity would be available at BPL." And that goes back to the point, sir, that I mentioned earlier about why there was no concerted effort at this time to seek an expansion of the blood products laboratory at Elstree.
That meant BPL Elstree, did it?
Well, again, the terminology isn't absolutely clear, and it could mean sometimes BPL is used as a term to cover both Elstree and Liberton. From the previous documents, the discussion was very much that you would need to provide self-sufficiency across the UK. You need both plants. And my reading of this is that is what was intended to be meant, even if that's not necessarily expressly recorded. There was a further meeting of the regional transfusion directors on the 27th of September 1973, where some of the practical issues and difficulties involved in increasing plasma supply were discussed. That brings us to January 1974, at which point a significant reconsideration of future demand took place. And if we could go, please, Paul, to PRSE 302350. We can see, so this is a paper that is a report from the Medical Research Council's Transfusion Research Committee Working Party on the cryoprecipitate method of preparing AHF concentrates. So it is a MRC working party which has been put together, and we can see who is on it from the front page. Dr. Biggs in the chair, and then other members include Dr. Rizza, Professor Blackburn, Dr. Delamore, Dr. Dormandy, Professor Ingram, and Dr. Maycock, among others. This working party produced a report, and it drew very heavily on Dr. Biggs's earlier work and earlier paper, so I won't take you through all of it. But there is a slight, or a significant, adjustment of the figures for the donations required. And if we could turn, please, Paul, to page 21 of the document, and we'll go to the conclusions. Conclusion 1 is that calculations suggest that the amount of material required for optimum treatment of all the haemophilic patients in Great Britain would be derived from 547,540 to 750,000 blood donations a year. This material would be used for on-demand treatment of all patients, including home treatment of the 1,000 or so patients who might benefit from it. The present supply is that derived from approximately 300,000 blood donations a year, of which most is in the form of cryoprecipitate. Just pausing there, sir. I'll deal first with that figure. So it's gone up from 400,000 to 750,000 to 547,540. The explanation for that is that there had been a recalculation of the minimum number of people with haemophilia in the UK. I'm going to use the term the UK because I'm very confident that this refers to the UK, not just Great Britain. Now, previously, Dr. Biggs had said that that figure was at least 1,754 and was almost certainly more than that. In this paper, the lower figure is 2,434. That is taken from data which have been obtained from haemophilia centres and certain other assumptions which are explained in the paper. So that explains why the lower figure has gone up, the lower estimate for the number of blood donations required has gone up from 400,000 to pretty much 550,000. I would also note, sir, this paper is later published in the British Journal of Haematology, and a slightly different figure is given there, which is between 511,000 and 720,000 donations. So not quite as high as is covered in this paper, but certainly closer to that than the original estimate of 400,000. The first conclusion also addresses some of the issues that we have been discussing earlier. There is a reference to all patients, so presumably meaning patients with severe, moderate and mild haemophilia. And included within that figure is again this 1,000 or so patients who would most benefit from home treatment, the most severely affected. And very clearly stated that this is about on-demand treatment, so the same assumptions that had informed Dr. Biggs's earlier paper and the discussions of it. That on-demand treatment was to include the home treatment of the 1,000 or so most severely affected patients. Returning to the conclusions, I won't take you through all of them because they are echoes of Dr. Biggs's earlier work. There's a discussion at conclusions 2 and 3 about comparisons between cryo and concentrates. Paragraph 4 on the next page, and I quote, "For home treatment, it is our opinion that a freeze-dried concentrate is the therapeutic material of choice. The gradual introduction to home treatment of the most severely affected patients who have the most frequent bleeding would reduce hospital management of haemophilia by half. To give this proportion of patients, approximately 1,000, home treatment, would involve the use of factor VIII concentrate from about 250,000 blood donations a year. The present 1973 total of factor VIII concentrate is derived from 40,000 to 45,000 donations a year." Just pause there to note so that we're back to the 250,000 figure rather than the 275,000 figure, which the regional transfusion directors had arrived at. And I also note that the figures of donations devoted to concentrate had gone up by 1973 to 40 to 45,000 from the original 25,000. Back to the document in paragraph 5. The number of donations contributing to pools of plasma used to make concentrates does affect the probability that a particular pool may contain hepatitis virus. However, the incidence of jaundice in multi-transfused patients seems to be, to some extent at least, dose-related. In practice, the incidence of jaundice in multi-transfused haemophilic patients does not rise very greatly with the use of freeze-dried concentrates. In any case, with universal screening of donors for hepatitis B antigen now in operation, the danger of infection will decrease to some extent in the future. The incidence of anti-factor VIII antibodies is not affected by the type of human material used to treat the patient. 6. We think that within the next few years, a great effort should be made to increase the amount of plasma which is fractionated in the United Kingdom. From the point of view of patients with haemophilia and Christmas disease, present estimations suggest a need for 547,540 to 750,000 donations to be fractionated annually to produce freeze-dried factor VIII. On a national scale, this need for factor VIII must be coordinated with other demands of a transfusion service, for example, the need for albumin fraction. Clearly, a 20-fold increase in fractionation cannot be achieved overnight, but it is to be hoped that very substantial increase may occur without too much delay. The present estimate of the need for factor VIII is based on data now available, and as time passes and more concentrates become available, the true amount of factor VIII required will be defined more certainly. Our present opinion is that the provision of freeze-dried material from 500,000 blood donations annually will do as much to improve the lives of haemophilic patients as was achieved several years ago by the provision of cryoprecipitate. 7. Freeze-dried factor VIII concentrate of good quality is now available commercially. At present, patient treatment at many of the haemophilia centres in this country involves a dangerous policy of balancing the needs of one patient against those of another and of delaying reconstructive orthopaedic surgery, which would greatly improve the lives of many patients. We believe it is very important that the material made in the United Kingdom, which is second to none in quality, should be substantially increased in amount. In the interim period, before the United Kingdom product is available in adequate amounts, commercial factor VIII should be bought in quantities sufficient to satisfy the needs of these patients.
Can you just help? The claim is there made that the material made in the United Kingdom is, quote, second to none in quality.
Yes.
Is there any description anywhere as to how quality was to be assessed?
There isn't a single document, I think, that sets that out. There is discussion in some of the other meetings, which really echoes what is said there, that the domestically made product is as good to use as the commercial products. Now, I have inferred from that discussion that that is a reference to things such as the solubility of the product, the lack of inhibitor reactions to it, the ease of storage, for example, but that is not expressly stated. The discussion on safety is that at paragraph 5 and echoes the discussions that were previously had. I'm just going to go back over those numbers again, sir, because I'm conscious that we have a different set of numbers, and it's helpful perhaps just to pause and take stock of what they are. So the MRC are saying, have presented 3 figures in their conclusions. The first is that range from 547,540 to 750,000 donations. And that is stated to be the overall need for donations for optimal treatment for all people with haemophilia. It is presented in conclusion 1 as a figure that encompasses both factor 8 and cryoprecipitate, and it is compared with the current position of 300,000 donations. However, later there is a discussion about how there is a desire for all or most of that figure to be made up in concentrates in the long run. So that is 574,540 to 750,000, an increase, as we've said, on the previous estimate of 400,000 to 750,000. The second figure is that figure of 250,000 donations for home treatment for the 1,000 most severely affected patients. That is consistent with what Dr. Biggs had said before, and as we've seen, the regional transfusion directors have said actually that figure should be about 275,000 to adjust for the amount of plasma that can be taken from a blood donation. The third figure that the MRC give is 500,000 donations, which in their view should be dedicated to concentrates in order to improve the life of people with haemophilia as much as the introduction of cryoprecipitate did. The final recommendation is about how the UK should both increase its own domestic supply and also buy commercial concentrates to cover the shortfall in the interim. This paper was presented by Dr. Biggs, who I take to be the lead author of it, to the directors of haemophilia centres and blood transfusion centres at a meeting that was held on the 31st of January 1974. Paul, please could we go to CBLA 40187. We can see from the top of that page that this is a joint meeting, and it is held to discuss Dr. Biggs's paper, among other matters. Chair is Professor Blackburn. I won't go through the full list of those who attended and sent apologies. There were 41 representatives from haemophilia centres and hospitals, 5 representatives from regional transfusion centres. Dr. Maycock was present from BPL, and Dr. Waiter was among those present from DHSS. If we could go, please, Paul, to page 4 of the paper, of the minutes. we can see that item 3 is for present and future supply of factor 8, and Dr. Biggs introduced the MRC Working Party report that we have just looked at. And if we go down just to the bottom of that paragraph, we can see that Dr. Biggs said that the report suggested a need for material derived from 500,000 to 750,000 donations annually. That is the range that she is giving there. There then followed discussion. We look at the next page. First item was how many people with haemophilia there were in the United Kingdom. I won't go through that discussion, but if I could just ask Paul to go to point 3. Point raised by Dr. Ingram, who spoke on the long-term forecast of factor 8 requirements and stressed that the incidence of haemophilia is likely to rise as treatment improved, and any assessment of the amount of anti-haemophilic globulin required for therapy must take this into account. So Dr. Ingram flagging the point that as the population increases due to better treatment, you will need more factor concentrate. Then I will read the next part of the discussion, which is what kind of material was best for treatment. And I quote, "There was a wide-ranging discussion about the relative merits of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried concentrates with regard to ease of manufacture, recovery from original plasma, ease of administration, and recovery of activity in the patients. It was generally felt that larger supplies of concentrated preparations were required now and urgently, and some felt that it was rather meaningless to ask doctors if they would prefer freeze-dried concentrates to cryoprecipitate when no freeze-dried concentrates were available to them. When the discussion was completed, the meeting was asked to indicate whether anyone would in fact prefer to have cryoprecipitate if freeze-dried concentrates were freely available. It was clear that none of those present would prefer cryoprecipitate. The next section of the meeting discusses how much material was likely to be needed, and we hear a dissenting view from Dr. Bowley, who was a original transfusion director. I'm afraid Sheffield Blood Transfusion Centre. And Dr. Bowley, I won't go into this in detail, but he criticised Dr. Biggs's figures and thought that she was overestimating the amount of future need, and he suggested that it was lower. It is not a view which gains much traction, so I won't go into it in any further detail. If we go to the bottom of that page, it says, and I quote, "In view of all that had been said, the chairman concluded that with one exception," and I take that to be Dr. Bowley, the meeting...
I think we need... Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, thank you. The meeting supported and wholeheartedly endorsed the Appendix B document, that is the MRC report. Again, it was stressed that the estimates in Appendix B are just for present and that in 5 years' time there may be a need for more material. Action. The chairman agreed to write to the DHSS saying that the meeting of the Haemophilia Centre directors and transfusion directors approved the contents of Appendix B and recommended that this document be used as the basis for planning the future requirements for Factor 8 in the United Kingdom. The meeting then went on to discuss problems which would arise in trying to increase the supply of Factor 8 freeze-dried concentrates. It was felt that once the new fractionation laboratories in Edinburgh and at the Lister Institute, that's BPL and Elstree, were in full production, they should be able to meet the needs of the country provided sufficient plasma was available. Some blood transfusion directors felt that plasmapheresis, which was already being carried out on a large scale in some centres, might be the answer to the problems of plasma supplies. Dr. Cleghorn described his procedure and said that his donor found it acceptable and not distressing. There was no doubt that the processing of more blood to obtain plasma for manufacture of Factor 8 would require more staff, equipment, mobile vans with cold storage facilities, etc., and that this would add to the blood transfusion centre's costs. Dr. Waiter could give no statement as to how this extra expense would be met, but she said that it should, in the first instance, be referred to the DHSS. She made the point that the purchase of commercial AHG was already costing the DHSS a lot of money. The meeting digressed for a short time to discuss the problems of genetic counselling. I won't take you through that. Several directors said they did not treat all the patients at the centres since this was too inconvenient for the patient and too difficult. On the other hand, they were aware that the materials might not be used properly. This raised the question of home therapy. It was stressed that home therapy was becoming more accepted and widespread and was improving the quality of patients' lives. Cryoprecipitate was not ideal for home therapy from many points of view. Some directors were buying commercial AHG for use in home therapy. If we could just go back to the previous page, Paul, just to pick up a couple of points from that. The joint meeting of the Haemophilia Centre directors and the blood transfusion directors therefore gave a ringing endorsement of the MRC paper that we have already looked at and of the estimates that it contained, in particular at least 500,000 to 750,000 donations per annum. They recommended that the MRC report should be used as the basis for future planning. We can see about halfway down the page a statement again that once the new fractionation laboratories at PFC and BPL were up and running in full production, then they should be able to meet the needs of the country, provided sufficient plasma was available. Again, so I go back to that question of why it is that BPL was not redeveloped at that time, and this may be the answer. That plays out in the way that the £500,000 that Dr. Owen makes available is subsequently spent, something that we will come to later. Finally, just a couple of points on what Dr. Waiter is recorded as saying. She said that in the first instance, the costs of increasing plasma production, which have been raised at the meeting, should be referred to the DHSS. I take that to mean that there is a need to consider that centrally, in Dr. Waiter's view, rather than in first instance in the regions. This gives rise to significant debate in the months that follow about who should pay for the improvements that are needed in order to increase plasma supply. The second point that Dr. Waiter made was that the DHSS, if looked at cumulatively, was already paying a lot of money for commercial concentrates, and that could be offset against the costs of future production. I don't think it is too far of a stretch to say that one can see here that Dr. Waiter is sympathetic to this argument. But of course, Dr. Waiter is one individual within the DHSS.
Well, what she seems to be saying is the DHSS is paying centrally to buy commercial product. The production, the greater production, which is capable on the basis that the meeting decide, capable of being fulfilled by BPL, Elstree and PFC in Liberton, if they're given enough plasma. That requires enough plasma. That'll cost a bit more money, but because it's going to save money from the DHSS currently paying centrally, that's where you get your money from. It's the subtext.
Yes, and that is an argument which is made repeatedly in the papers by various people, including Dr. Waiter.
But as you say, it cuts against the principle of regional payment.
It does, sir. And what we will see in the papers that follow is that in order to expand plasma supply requires significant upfront capital costs and indeed revenue costs that recur. But those will be incurred upfront, and you won't get your increased plasma supply until sometime afterwards because it takes a while to work through the system. Buying concentrates commercially will cost less in the short term than your significant capital costs, and you will get the concentrates immediately. So there is a trade-off between a short-term and a long-term cost, both for the regional health authorities and indeed for the DHSS generally. And that is perhaps a dynamic which is important in the events that follow. The response of the DHSS to this meeting is considered from paragraph 73 of the written presentation. I won't take you to the documents there. There was a minute from Mr. Jackson of the DHSS, dated the 14th of February 1974, in which he refers to the fact that 8 out of 14 regional transfusion centres had provided the DHSS with estimates as to how much money would be required to increase their plasma supply. And he had extrapolated from those estimates that across the country, about £160,000 would be needed for extra accommodation, equipment, staff and transport, and that BPL would also require about £45,000 for capital works. That is, as Mr. Jackson says, a calculation which is a rough one. It is not based on data from all of the centres. Now, Mr. Jackson says in that minute, and I quote, "The cost of increasing the production of plasma is modest," end quote, when compared to the cost of commercial products. So the point that we have just been discussing. Mr. Jackson's minute triggers a debate amongst the HSS officials about whether central funds should be provided or whether the regions should be left to fund these improvements themselves. It's clear from the relevant documents that there is an awareness, an acute awareness, that this debate is taking place at a time of great pressure on public expenditure. To quote from one document, I quote, that public expenditure reductions had, and I quote, been so severe that regional health authorities will be unable to carry through all the projects that the department would like to see. So there is a recognition that the regions are very pushed for money. But as of the 19th of April 1974, we have a minute from that date, the position of the DHSS was that no central funds would be made available to the regions. By that time, the estimate for how much the improvements were going to cost had gone up to being not less than £1 million. And the point made in the documentation is that the savings on the cost of commercial concentrates would be savings that benefited the regions. Therefore, it was for the regions to put forward the capital costs to improve the supply of plasma in order to get the benefit of those savings. Now, that lack of central funding, coming at the same time as the DHSS and others are pushing for an increase in plasma supply, caused tension, as one might expect. And just to give one example of that, if we could go, please, Paul, to DHSC 010005_094. This is a letter which is written from Mr. Scott, who is the Regional Medical Officer of the Trent Regional Health Authority, and it is written to Dr. Maycock. It's dated the 16th of May 1974, and it is entitled Provision of Plasma for factor VIII concentrate. And what Dr. Scott says is this, and I quote, "I have recently received from Dr. Wagstaff," that is the Director of a Regional Transfusion Centre, "a request for 17,000 capital and £29,000 recurrent revenue to meet the cost of providing fresh frozen plasma for the manufacture of factor VIII concentrate. It seems that the DHSS was expected to meet these costs, but not unexpectedly, it has referred the matter to regions." I cannot comment on other regions' finances at this time, but in the light of information currently available to me, there is no hope whatsoever of the Trent Regional Health Authority meeting these demands. I find this situation disturbing because a national edict of this kind threatens to distort other regional priorities. Equally, I'm very unhappy at not being able to offer encouragement to the Sheffield Centre, which has always prided itself on being to the fore in such developments. I would value your comments and advice. And that was sent, as I say, by Dr. Scott, an indication of the tension that has developed between the regions and the DHSS in this area. Note the time, so I wonder if that might be a good point to stop for lunch.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now, shall we, till 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.